Welcome to the High Performance Hockey Podcast. Today we're joined by research and development professional and sports science analyst for the Seattle Seahawks in the National Football League, Dr. Patrick Ward. Patrick's current work centers on research and development in professional sport with an emphasis on data analysis in American football. Previously, Patrick was a sports scientist within the Nike Sports Research Lab. He also founded Optimum Sports Performance in Tempe, Arizona, a strength and conditioning facility where he trained high school, collegiate, and professional athletes. Patrick has been invited to present research and speak at conferences, including MIT Sloan Analytics Conference, Cascadia Symposium of Statistics in Sport, World Congress of Science in Football, and NSCA National Conference. His research interests include training and competition, analysis as they apply to the athlete, health, injury, and performance across a variety of sports. Patrick is a PhD in sports science from Liverpool John Moores University and is a National Strength and Conditioning Association certified strength and conditioning specialist. It's a truly unique and insightful conversation that we have with Patrick today. We speak about what he does for the Seattle Seahawks, this idea of research and development, sports science, the back end, the model that he uses, the domains that he uses. We talk about the blog post that he had that got a lot of attention, titled, "Can I Please Be Introduced to the Non-Applied Sports Scientist?" It's a delightful conversation. Learned a ton. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Patrick. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's great to be here and talk with you. Really cool thing that you're doing with these podcast interviews. You've had some outstanding guests, so hopefully I won't disappoint.
Oh, I know you won't. One of the smartest individuals I had the chance to learn from, continue to learn from, met a long time ago at BSMPG. And I read your information. I follow you from a distance. And I'm really delighted that we're going to have you here to learn from the audience. I know it's a hockey-based podcast, but there's a lot of practitioners from a lot of different sports that I know we can get a lot of great information and scale a great message this hour. So really excited to have you, Patrick. I want to start by asking you, you're a member of the Seahawks Research and Development in Sport and a sports science analyst. So what the heck is that? Could you break that job description down? Let's start with the research and development and then the sports analyst.
Yeah, well, I'm the director of the research and analytics department. So there's several of us, database engineer, 2 end user application developers, 4 analysts, and really kind of my thing is in this role is trying to manage the research strategy for football operations. So that's everything from sports science type stuff, like you mentioned, which is where I actually started with the team, all the way through to to draft and player acquisition, player value modeling. Obviously, that's a popular thing right now with the draft coming up. In season, it's team-based valuation, tendencies, opposition strengths. We have 2 analysts that are primarily dedicated to football and know way more football than I do. So I'm sort of a backseat to them there and help out where I can. Most of my work is on the kind of front office player evaluation side and then sports science analytics. But just trying to oversee the overall research strategy for football operations and kind of how we tie together all of the data and the questions that our end users, our decision makers have across, we'll call it our four main clients, if you will. So we've got, front office scouting, we've got coaching, we've got medical athletic training, which is obviously going to be return to play and things like that, player health. And then we have strength and conditioning, which is physical preparation. So those would be our 4 primary clients. And depending on the time of the year, the amount of dedication that goes into research projects for those clients changes depending on sort of the seasonality of the sport. So again, obviously draft and player acquisition right now would be front and center in season. It's definitely based more heavily on, coaching and opposition and, player recovery and preparation across the week to get ready for the next game. And then once the draft ends, we'll have OTAs and training camp, and that'll be more strength and conditioning focused, directed at the physical preparation side of things.
Geez, that sounds very, very layered. Are you aware of anyone else in the National Football League that has an R&D and sports science team like this, or is this common? I don't. Again, I'm not in the belly of the beast in the National Hockey League, but I'm not aware of a model like that within the National Hockey League.
Yeah, I don't know for hockey, but in football, I'd say, as far as being common, I don't know what percentage of teams we'd have to say would be doing something along these lines to say that it's common, but every team, all 32 teams probably have some form of analysis. The depth changes. It's always hard to kind of gauge what other teams have or what they're doing.
Sure.
I'd say there's probably about 6 or 7 or 8 of us that have a program similar to this that sort of overreaches several departments within operations.
Science starts and ends with problems. So who are the gatekeepers in each of those divisions? Do you meet with them quarterly? For example, front office staff, is that your general manager? Mm-hmm. Obviously, coaching staff, your head coach, your assistant coaches, medical, your lead doctor, and strength and conditioning, your head strength coach. Are the problems and the questions led by them? Hey, what would you like to help us solve if we're able to? And then do you meet with them and iterate over time?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a little of both. Obviously, there's things that we get curious about and, dedicate some time to, and building some research projects around those things in the hopes that we can take those and educate and share. A lot of times we try and engage with the end users, the decision makers, by first just sitting in meetings and listening. So if I hear them talk about things and I hear the way that they're talking about things, or maybe the problems that they have, or they're trying to solve for, a lot of times they might not know that we have data that could help with this, or they might not even know that we could use the data in a certain way to help with that problem. So that allows us to kind of go back and, build up sort of like a worked model that shows a proof of concept, and then we can go from there. I'm a big fan of, in the statistical literature, it's called the PPDAC framework. So problem, plan, data, analysis, and conclusion. And it's a framework, I think probably the main papers were McKay, I think in 1994, and then 2001. The 2001 paper was like brilliant. They talk about applying that model to the investigation of the speed of light. And it's like this 27-page paper. And it's just really cool how the thought process unveils. But starting with the problem, that's really where we try and engage the decision maker. So even if we have an idea that we're coming up with, we'd want to sit with someone and be like, hey, what do you think about this? And, I was thinking about it like this. And because domain experts have a lot of value. And if we just sort of like block ourselves off and do research projects, there might be some interest in the end product. But if we can engage a decision maker and make them feel like they're part of the scientific process, one, it helps a lot with buy-in because they feel like they've contributed to the approach. And two, it helps us a ton from wasting time, because sometimes the domain experts can add context that we can't knowably see in the data alone, in the raw numbers.
So you said you PPDAC. You said problem was the first one. Can you repeat the second?
Plan. Yeah, problem, okay. Plan, data.
Yep.
Analysis and conclusion.
Could you walk us through that process? We talked about the problem.
Yeah. So the problem, exactly. You're trying to state what it is you're looking, what the problem is. You're trying to maybe evaluate what sort of populations you're concerned with, or you're trying to understand within that phase. Like I think about, like, as I'm sitting there listening to them talk about it, I'm thinking, okay, what type of problem is this? Is it like going to be a descriptive problem? Is it a inferential type of problem? Is it a predictive or forecasting type of problem? Like, where are we going to go with this? I always try and get them to tell me as much as possible. Oftentimes, decision makers, they don't think from like scientific questioning type of framework. So they'll ask a question and I'll be like, oh gosh, that's rather vague. initially they would get annoyed when I do this, but the problem is that if I just take a vague question from them and I go off and do something, I come back a week later or 2 weeks later and they say, oh, that's cool, but what I was thinking was this. And I'm like, oh, if you would have told me. So I always say, like, ask Socratic questions. So question the question. So I just pepper the heck out of them. Like, okay, that's an interesting question. Like, can you walk me through how you would use that? What would you hope to get from this? Like, if I could get you that analysis, like, what kind of decision would you make? As they start talking about it, it starts to unveil the real question that they have. Or sometimes as they start talking about it, they go, you're right. Like, this question, it's kind of half baked. It's probably not a good enough idea right now. So, okay, that's cool. We can table that and focus on something else. So after we've established what the problem is, the plan is really where we get into, like, okay, what type of analysis is this? Descriptive? Is it inferential or causal? Is it, predictive or forecasting? What's the data that we're going to require? Is it something that we already have? Do we have to go out and maybe scrape it from the web? Is it something that we have to, like, manually collect? Maybe it's something that is data that we're not currently capturing. So we roll out a plan, like, how are we going to deal with this? After that, we get to the data phase, where now we're ready to bring that data in, clean it, look for any, like, gotchas, like weird, this data is useful, but it doesn't have, like, a key that we can join on to the other data we need. How are we going to solve for that? We have some missing values. What do we want to do with that? All the gotchas get handled there. And then you get to the analysis phase, where we're building and testing models. So we'll build several models, we'll test them, we'll compare them to each other, compare them to a benchmark. Because obviously, if the model doesn't beat the benchmark, why would we need a model? We just use the benchmark. So build some simulations and try and see how the model behaves under different circumstances. Does this make sense? Is it going to be useful? And then conclusion is the way that we're going to share this out. So I always think of sharing conclusions in kind of two ways, which is, one, is this a project that was designed to generate new knowledge, in which case we would share it as, like, a research report. So we put the bottom line up front. This was the question. Bottom line up front is that these are the 3 things we found. And then if you want to read the gory details, this was the data. These were kind of the assumptions that we made in the limitations. This is how we handled the data. And then this is the type of analysis, and this is what we found. If the conclusion is not just to generate new knowledge, but is something that needs to be within the sort of weekly cadence or daily cadence, now we have to think about operationalizing the model so that it can run hot. So, like, we got to build this into a web app. Okay, now I have to take this model and think about, like, geez, how am I going to structure the data? What's the workflow got to be for this to work inside of a web app so that it can, process everything in a timely manner? How frequently do I need this to, like, refresh? I have to have that look back and say, like, man, every Monday morning, if there's been a slate of games on Sunday, look at the database. If there's new data, pull it in, return predictions, spit them out. Here's the web app. So that's a little bit more involved. But those are the kind of the 2 ways that I think about sharing conclusions with the end users. And again, we try and bring them with all of those 5 steps. We try and bring the domain expert in at each time. So we update them. We've got a great opportunity where every Friday we sit with our scouts that are in the building, and we do an hour presentation where we get a chance to, like, educate, talk about some of these things, show them where we're at with stuff, pick up new questions or iterations that they might have along the way. And that's really cool, right? Because again, like, non-technical audience, and now after several years of this, they use things like, oh, regression to the mean, or what's my base rate for that? Like, would we expect this to regress back to his base rate, or, and that's, it's a cool opportunity for us, but it's a cool opportunity for them to have a chance to, learn a little bit about numeracy and how numbers work and things like that. So
I really like this problem, plan, data, analysis, and conclusion. And
yeah, I can send you some papers for the show notes or something.
That would be outstanding. I'd like to read them selfishly, and then I'd like to attach them to show notes.
Yeah,
it reminds me a little of the Popperian. You've got your initial problem, temporary theory. You've got your error eliminators, and then a new problem emerges, right? Eventually, science starts and ends with them, right?
No, that's right. Yeah, and it's a cyclical process, so it doesn't end with conclusion. It goes in a circle. But yeah, I'll send you a few of the papers for the show notes. Yeah.
$1 million question, and I don't want to jump over here because I want to get to this blog post. And I know it probably depends, and I can give you some substance or some meat on the bone. But can we measure hard things in sports science? Here's what I mean by that, right? They say input, output, and outcome. The hardest things to measure in team sport are closest to the scoreboard, right? How do we get close to that? Are we just, as sports scientists, from the physical sciences? I know you said there's four. You got the front office, the coaches. Let's talk about the strength and conditioning, right? Are we measuring outputs? Should that be our job? And how close can we get to measuring and separating signal from the noise the closer we get to the scoreboard?
Yeah, this is a great question. I feel like it's hard. Team sport is always hard. Yeah,
Sure.
if we were talking about Olympic athletes, for a strength coach, I mean, if I make the athletes stronger, if I make them more fit, I expect a faster 400-meter dash time. I expect a better Tour de France time. The quantifiables within those sports, the KPIs, are directly related to the sport themselves. So it's
Sure.
easy to map that.
Sure.
Team sport is a little messy, and oftentimes people will punt, right? They'll throw their hands up and say, well, we can't do it, so we shouldn't do anything. Or they'll say, well, it's too complex, so we shouldn't worry about it. And a lot of times I come back to another one for the show notes would be Douglas Hubbard's book, How to Measure Anything. He's a great just writer, and he consults to the government and businesses and military on how to measure what people would call the intangibles, the things that we think we can't measure.
Sure.
And so he'll go into these companies and he'll calibrate the staff on, how to make an estimation. Like, let's say, is this person a good worker? Like, how do we estimate that? How do we estimate a prediction interval? The whole book goes through these things, but his three sort of axioms for how to measure anything. When he goes in, the companies say, well, we can't really measure this. It's an intangible, leadership or something like that. So his three axioms are, what is it? Why is it important? And then what does it look like when we see it? And if you can start to describe what it looks like when you see it, we can maybe tease out things that are of value. So I could give you an example in sport that would be strength and conditioning centric. I had some friends in the NBA, and they were telling me, oh, we're trying to figure out, our point guards are horrible at defending the three. Like, they close out slower than anybody in the league. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Well, why do you think that? Or they're like, well, we're not really defending many threes. They're not getting out there fast enough. And I'm like, oh, interesting. And I'm like, well, are they like not athletic? Or and they're like, I think they're pretty good athletes. We measure them and they seem to be pretty good athletes, but I don't know. It's just too complicated. Like, how would we even measure this? I'm like, well, let's like walk this back. If you have wearable tracking data, which you do, you have Sports View, or I think it's called still, or maybe it's Second Spectrum now. You have that for every game, for every player at a 10th of a second, 10 hertz. You have events, so when a three was shot. So if I take tracking data and I take those events and I say, you know what, show me all the threes when the opposition shot a three, and roll back the 10th of a second raw data about a second and a half, and tell me where my players were, the defending player, where he was relative to that man taking the three, and then calculate things like the velocity and acceleration of his ability to close that distance from when the three was shot, where that event was tagged. So if we can start to think like that, that means we can start to think about, well, is the problem that we have a coaching problem? Man, our guys are actually further from the guy that they're supposed to be guarding than anybody else in the league. So do we have our guys in the right position? Is it a processing problem? You know what? Like, when we test this guy in the preseason on his, change of direction test, on his reactive agility test, on his force plate jumps and his impulse and all these things, he's like the 90th percentile of all these guys that we tested. But he closes out slow, but his distance to the player is okay. Maybe it's a processing problem, or maybe it is an athletic problem. Maybe he's like, yeah, he's close enough, but this guy's just not a great athlete. How do we train? Now, as a strength coach, I could say, like, well, can I train to improve someone's ability to move quickly, lateral quickness? Sure. If I start and institute a training program for that in 3, 4, 5, it's probably 6 or 7 or 8 weeks, do I then start to see this guy close out on threes faster?
Sure.
So unlike the individual Olympic sport type of situation where everything maps to performance pretty clearly, in team sport it's noisier, and that doesn't mean that it can't be done. It does mean that it's harder, but we have to be much better at defining the parameters that we want to understand these things. If I can define the parameters, like closing out on a three, like a linebacker coming downhill to make a tackle in the run game, if I can define those parameters, then I can start to use some of this data to answer those questions and hopefully identify problems where we can then add a training program. We can institute some sort of measure that helps us make change. And that's ultimately what we want, right? As a strength coach, your job should be performance. So start looking at the game from the lens of what elements of performance can I impact within the sport, and how would I test those things, and what's sort of the proxy measure that allows me to know we're getting better at doing this thing, which maps in some way to these constraints or parameters that we've put around the game to evaluate this one thing.
I'm going to follow up with a couple more questions related to that as we address your blog post, but I got one more question I want to piggyback with regarding measures.
Mm-hmm.
As a sports analyst and a R&D individual and a highly trained academic PhD, before you measure things, do you always think the counter, meaning what are the unintended consequences of the measure too? Are we focusing on one area and all of a sudden that individual is worried about something at the expense of another, or whether it's sleep tracking or questionnaires and, maybe it's a placebo, nocebo. Should we be trained to think like that? What are the unintended consequences of the measures or overanalyzing?
It's always something that you need to be aware of, particularly when we're dealing with performance and particularly when we're dealing with individuals. Traditionally, science operates at the group level, right? The idea is very nomothetic research, right? We want to apply some sort of intervention to a group of people, and we want to apply a placebo to a group of individuals that are similar in some way. And the idea is to see if the intervention that we applied is better than the placebo. And the end result is to say, on average for the population, it looks like this works. But we don't deal with populations. We deal with individuals as a practitioner, as a rehab specialist, as a strength coach, as a nutritionist, whatever it is. And so that's really where you have to kind of break free and look at like idiographic research, single subject research design, and things like that. So I'm always thinking of, and we have a paper that's about to be published on this coming up. We just submitted, but I did write a paper in 2019 called Putting the Eye Back in Team, which discusses some of this stuff. So I tend to think about analysis in that regard is like, if we're observing a human in serial measurement over time, which is what happens in sport. They come in, they put on GPSs, or they get measured in the game, or they do force plate jumps, or they do sleep trackers, or wellness, or RPs, or whatever it is. We're measuring them serially over many weeks, months of a season. And we often don't have the ability to intervene like we would in science. We're sort of casual observers. Interventions or changes are made to the program, sometimes by people on staff, sometimes as a consequence of how the season goes. And we're observers. And for me, I'm always thinking about N of one type of research analysis. How do I apply it here? And when I see something that looks to be outside of what I would normally expect, that's when I say, oh, that's interesting. I wonder why this person is behaving this way, because it's different than I would normally expect from the 5 other people. And it might not be bad, but it's just different. The unintended consequence piece is if we notice that something is different and we do nothing about it. We have no conversation. We don't attempt to, speak to the individual and say like, hey, how's it going? What are we missing here? And sometimes the unintended consequences piece might be the it might be on us in terms of how we explain this stuff up front. Sleep tracking is a great one. Handing out sleep wristbands or whatever to people and saying, hey, we want to track your sleep and see how well you're doing and really monitor that. That's okay. But is that really closing the loop? Like, I would rather say, like, hey, we're going to monitor sleep because we know how important it is for performance. And we just want to ensure that we're helping you be your best on game day. And so maybe we monitor and we do nothing for 2 weeks. Observations. And this is the single subject research design. So now we have this pattern. We have these 7 days, we have 14 days, 2 weeks of sleep data. And we notice, Anthony does, he's kind of like not sleeping very well, maybe because he's in the hotel, maybe his wife just had a kid, whatever it is. Let's try and offer him some recommendations. I have to close the loop. Hey, Anthony, let's go over your sleep data. So we've got 2 weeks and you notice this, yeah, you're waking up a lot. Oh yeah, my wife, we just had a kid and okay, great. What if we could institute this as an intervention? And if you close the loop like that, they might be like, yeah, you know what, that could help. Or if we tie it back to something else, like, hey, notice on these nights where you sleep really poorly, your soreness is higher the next day. I really feel that I don't recover well. Okay, great. Let's institute some sort of, sleep approach or something that would enhance your sleep. And we can evaluate that for another 2 weeks. And again, back to that single subject design. If I have 14 days and I put a vertical bar, so pre-intervention, post-intervention, N of 1 analysis, and I can show that, hey, look at your soreness has improved, and perceptually, you're saying you sleep better, and look at all your sleep time has gotten better by this simple intervention. All of a sudden, instead of just making an athlete or an individual feel like they're part of a science project, we've distilled the data and the analysis down to them as an individual, and it's meaningful to them. And those are conversations that you have to have one-on-one. You can't have those with the group in front of the full team because it's embarrassing and it's silly and it doesn't make sense. But that's how I would think about it.
Brilliant. Okay. Can I please be introduced to the non-applied sports scientist, the blog?
Yeah.
Okay.
I
know there was some chatter back and forth on social media. I want to get to some areas in specific, some quotes that you have throughout the blog, but could you briefly explain to the listener who may not have read the blog, what was the impetus for writing it, perhaps a footnote version of some of your ideas, and then I want to nail down into the specifics.
Yeah. So there was a discussion the prior week about sports science and roles that people have. And this was something that I've always been thinking, because I go visit a team. Oh, this guy's the applied sports scientist. You talk to him, he does what you do. And I'm like, oh, cool. What do you do? And they're like, oh, I'm a strength coach, or I'm the athletic trainer, but I oversee making sure that the GPS is turned on, making sure the force plates are turned on. And I'm always like, well, what part of science are you applying? That doesn't make sense to me. That's not science. It's technology, sports technology, but it's not science, right? Printing reports, turning it on and off. It's important, obviously, because that gets you the data. You're not answering questions. You're not applying science. So my joke, which I guess is my fault, didn't traverse the internet well, was, well, if you're the applied science sports scientist, and I don't know what aspect of science you're applying, can I just be introduced to the non-applied sports scientist? Maybe and that was my thing, is well, maybe, what am I? Maybe I'm the non-applied sports scientist because I don't do those things, even though people say oh, talk to this guy, he does what you do. And I'm like, well, I don't know that he really does what I do, so that was kind of the joke of it. And really the idea behind the blog was, it's just like anything. We need to have, when you give someone a title, there should be definitive roles that they have. If I'm giving a title as head strength coach to someone, I am expecting that they know how to write and evaluate a needs analysis. I'm expecting that they know how to build a training program and periodization, and that they understand the game demands and how training in the weight room impacts practice and things like that. If I'm hiring a medical person, I'm expecting that they know basics of healing time, the base rates of injury healing times. And, they understand rehab and return to play and how ergonomics of sport matter in end stage return to play. If I'm hiring a sports scientist, I'm expecting that in the applied environment, they can conduct applied research. And there's a difference. Basic research is what, any basic research methods book will tell you this, but basic research is what we traditionally think about when we think of a scientist, the person in the lab with the lab coat. Basic does not mean simple.
Sure.
Okay. It could be very complex, but it's basic in terms of they're looking at something very, very discrete. They're trying to answer a very specific question. They're in a what I would call a sterile environment so that they can control the environment to know that what they're looking at is actually impacting or not impacting this thing. The applied world is much more messy. It's much more front-facing to the practitioner. It's a lot harder to handle the situation because the context is not controlled. It's controlled by someone else. It's controlled by the coach. If I'm hiring that person to do that role, I'm expecting that they understand scientific method. They understand how to apply science within that environment. They know how to do things like run reliability studies, and they know how to do things like build basic analysis around sports technologies, tracking data, force play data, those kinds of things. Those are the things that I tend to think about is it's less about just turning on technology and turning it off. And it's more about critically asking questions. And someone on LinkedIn actually asked me a question about this blog. A strength coach from a university said, well, don't you think all this data is really just confirming what we already know? And I'm like, well, I mean, it can confirm what we know if your question is, tell me these things that I already know. I mean, maybe you're just asking bad questions, and that's the problem. It's if we think back to that NBA example, or we apply it to hockey, or we apply it to football and the linebacker coming downhill, those are different sets of questions that get us to a very different endpoint. And that's where I would want my applied sports scientist working. That's how I would want them to be thinking.
This episode has been brought to you by the High Performance Hockey Masterclass. The High Performance Hockey Masterclass is a comprehensive lecture series exploring the science and practice of high performers in the sport of ice hockey. It was designed and created and engineered by myself, Anthony Donskoff. It is an 8-part lecture series that includes metric fixation, the tyranny of metrics, reading research, what matters, going back to get my PhD as a 40-year-old, how do you target your readings in terms of digesting, accumulating, and reading your research, biomechanical considerations for ice hockey, the adductor magnus, how we program hip health during the off-season and in-season, the Gain, Go, Grow model, this idea of a 3-day rollover program for high-performance hockey players, considerations for the in-season, how to manipulate that model for high performers, our communication structure within the confines of Donskoff Strength and Conditioning, and finally, the fast and frugal tree, considerations for return to play. More information on the High Performance Hockey Masterclass can be found at anthonygumroad.com. Thanks for listening. All right, I want you to provide me an example. Here's what I mean. So let's take an example of what I would consider the Texas sharpshooter, right? The Texan. Yeah. We think the Texan is a great shot, but no one knows that after he shoots against the farm door, he specifically draws the target. So essentially, in that particular case, we hypothesize after the fact. We're harking. In research, that's a big no-no, right?
Sure.
But we're collecting that data. We are seeing trends, and then we hypothesize after that. Would that be considered a non-applied sports scientist? And if that's not, or if it is rather, what would you say would be the comparison to the Texas sharpshooter in terms of how we would better partake in that job description? Does that make sense?
The idea of collect data first, ask questions later is a very naive approach to science. And we had a guy that used to work here. He no longer does, but he would always tell me like, oh, well, let's just start collecting this and, whatever. After a couple of months, you'll be able to find something. And I'm like, well, no, that's a waste of time because we're wasting not just my time, but we're wasting time of the staff to collect the things. And more importantly, we're wasting time with the players who have tons of touch points. These guys walk in, they see the equipment guy about your pad, see the nutritionist about your breakfast, see the, you got a media thing, then you got to meet with your coach, then you got a meeting, then you got to get to the training room, then you have a lift, then you have the touch points are so massive. So
Sure.
the idea of, and collect data first has been generally the approach that's been applied at universities and teams, professional teams in this country and abroad, because it's all about keeping up with the Joneses. Oh, that team got a GPS. We need to buy GPS.
Yeah.
And it's like, we don't need to buy anything. What we need to do is sit down and think about, well, what's the question that we want to ask? When I got here 10 years ago, one of the first things was, hey, we bought some GPS and accelerometers. What should we do with them? And I'm like, well, what would you like to know? And they're like, well, I think I kind of sat there and I wrote down well, first there's probably three things that we need to get after. The first is, one, are these things even valid for measuring football activities? I know you can open any paper and it says, this is a valid measure of human movement or human running or something like that. Valid is specific to the context in which it was tested. Validity, it was never tested in American football. There was a few, I think at the time there was 2 papers in college football, but nobody had seen if was this a valid measure. That was about the first chapter of my PhD, was if I put these on people and I get them on a field and I control all of the variables and I say, Anthony, run 10 yards. Anthony, run 10 yards and then break to the right. When you get to the 10-yard line, break to the right and do that 5 times, and then break to the left, and then do a change of direction drill, do a short shuttle. And then I'm going to put this on you and you're going to hit these pads, these bags. The first part was man, can these units even differentiate these activities outside of practice? If I can't differentiate, if I can't put that on someone and have the data identify that these are different running straight ahead is different than running and making a right cut, which is different than running and making a left cut, which is different than doing some sort of close space change of direction, which is different than hitting a bag. If I can't differentiate that, what is it? Putting it on someone at practice is useless, because that's even noisier than this, right? So that was the first goal. So that was my first thing. It's well, are these even, can they at least differentiate these activities? And once we saw that they could, it was, okay, now if we put them on people at practice, can they differentiate between position groups? Visually, we can see offensive linemen do different things than defensive backs, and defensive backs do different things than tight ends, wide receivers and running backs and quarterbacks. Can we differentiate between those position groups? And then once we could see that, it was okay, now we're getting somewhere. So if we have something that can identify the differences between position groups in a very crude way, these are worn on the torso. It's different than wearing an accelerometer on the shank or the limb, like limb-worn accelerometry. It's more measuring the shaking up of the torso. So there's noise in here. This isn't perfect. So people go to conferences and they talk about these things as if it's the greatest measure ever. It's it's pretty noisy. It's pretty crude. It tells us something. I don't think it tells us what we really want to know, which is probably muscle damage, but we're not measuring that with this. It's, it tells us something. So whatever, I'd say it's good enough for the implied environment. So that was the first question, was, are they valid for measuring these football actions? And if they are, can we differentiate between position groups? Once we knew we could do that, it was, well, can we model a training day? So if we have enough drills cataloged and we know a bunch of the kind of the metadata, that how many days of the game are we? Are we on turf or grass? Are we wearing helmets or pads or nothing, just tennis shoes or whatever? And we have these drills. Can we model this and build an expected training load for the day by position group, and then hopefully by individual if we use some sort of hierarchical model? Can we do that? And then start to look at man, given the context of today, we expected it to be this, but for these 3 guys, it was much higher. What could that be? Oh, you know what? Well, there was one of the running backs was down. So this guy actually had to take 2 times more reps than he would normally take. Oh shit. Well, that's really important information to know about how we're going to deal with this guy tonight, recovery-wise, maybe tomorrow morning, maybe practice tomorrow. Maybe the other guy needs to take a little bit more and give this guy a bit of a break going into the game. So could we model training a little bit? And then could we measure something about the unintended consequences, which was one of our Sloan papers, which was, can we just identify sessions that have a higher risk of injury given the way in which training was constructed? So those were kind of the three questions that we initially started with. But unlike the Texas shooter example, it wasn't about collecting data and then looking back and saying like, oh, we've got something. It was, we have an idea, we have a hypothesis about some of this stuff. We have a way of collecting some data, which we've now we've identified has some validity to it, can differentiate things that we think are important. Let's start to evaluate those questions under this type of data collection model and see what we get back. And we'll adjust and we'll go from there, and we'll update our knowledge as we go. It's a very kind of Bayesian way of thinking. We'll update our knowledge as we go. And that's kind of what we did. And that's what we continually do. The updating never stops. The team is different, every year. The coaches change. So that means drills change and players get older, and some players come in and are younger, and some players have a lower training age. All of these things are really important. And none of this stuff is solidified in gold. It's constantly needs to be updated. And all we're doing is we're saying right now, our prior knowledge before looking at anything going forward from today, our prior knowledge is this. We believe that football players behave like this. And 10 days from now, we'll have some data that updates that prior knowledge, and probably a little bit, but not by much. But over time, things start to shift and change.
Not being funny, almost like a signal sniffer. And here's what I mean by that, right? We talk about this. Would you go on and say another example of something like this? Like, let's just take force plates for an example. Everyone seems to have one, and now with the price point,
cheap,
even private facilities. So would an applied sports scientist also say, well, geez, there's 59 metrics to choose from. Which one's the most reliable? And which one's the most important for our demographic? Would those be, quote unquote, studies undertaken by an applied sports scientist?
Yeah, like here would be a great way to think about that. So one is like, what are we jumping for? So now we're back to the problem or the question. So are we jumping to identify athletes, maybe build archetypes? Like, okay, this, we have some impulse and RSI mod and, contact time. And we have a few variables we look at. Is it archetype analysis? Like, gosh, compared to other tight ends, this guy looks really athletic. That's pretty interesting. Or, which is probably the way that most people are using it in team sport, is, are we trying to use this as some sort of proxy gauge of like neuromuscular fatigue? Like, oh man, this person's kind of in the tank. And there's probably some psychological effect there where, if you have a bad game, guys are in a bad mood, they don't want to output as hard and jump, things like that. So if we take that example, let's think this through. As Douglas Hubbard says, you always have more information than you think. Like, prior knowledge would say like, oh, impulse looks like it's a pretty reliable measure. So let's go ahead and evaluate that with our team. And let's do a study. Let's say, off-season training, we want to know if this can identify fatigue in some way. So over the next 6 weeks of off-season training, let's test everybody in their jump and gather their impulse on a Monday. In theory, that we're going to call that the recovered state. They had a weekend off, they haven't trained, fine. And, there's things that confound this. Maybe they went out, maybe they flew to Vegas, all that stuff. But overall, maybe let's assume that should be a relatively recovered state. Then they go through their 4 days of lifting, running, practicing, training. So Thursday, we jump again, and that's our unrecovered state, right? The idea here is to evaluate, again, if we have the question up front, we can structure our data collection properly to figure out like, well, how much volume load, how are we going to collect volume load across the days? How are we going to aggregate that with GPS data to build a simple model, right? That represents the training demands for the given week holistically. If we have that, then we have an opportunity to evaluate the change in impulse between two states. it's not like in season. In season has different things going on, but does this give us decent prior knowledge to start a conversation once we get to in season, where it's going to be a lot harder to do something that's a little more controlled like that, a little bit more sterile of an environment? Yeah, it does. And so we would hope that, we will look at impulse and we'll look at several measures and we'll see how are these influenced. Look at those measures that have been based on prior literature. We'll see how are they influenced by the training week, controlling for volume and load and running load and things like that. And that gives us an opportunity to study the question which we initially had, which was, man, can we use this as sort of like a very crude proxy measure for fatigue to say, like, if we train at a certain amount, how does it influence or impact the person's, neuromuscular output? That would be one way that you could start to think about this, and you apply a 5 or 6 week study to that. And that allows you to build a simple model that then hopefully for the whole year going into the season, you have a model that you can apply and hopefully help you make some decisions or have conversations around what it means within the context of everything else that's being collected and generated throughout the season, and the health and how the player came out of the game and all of that kind of stuff.
The applied versus non-applied, I'm going to come back to it. Do you feel that's an issue that has more to do with time or lack thereof of time? Meaning, I want answers now from a head coach, or hey, I've got one strength coach on staff, let alone an assistant strength coach. Yeah. Or do you think it's, and maybe this is happening and I'm just not privy to it. Maybe there are analysts in the back end who have done these research studies. I'm not aware of that. Or do you think it's a matter of training? Like the way it's explained to me, at least talking with you, is that individual's not only thoroughly educated in the scientific process, and you don't have to be a PhD or an undergrad. Anyone can be educated in the scientific process.
That's right.
We get that.
Yeah.
But it also sounds like you mentioned Bayesian, you mentioned inferential, you mentioned descriptive statistics. So it sounds like the individual, he or she, would also have to be well-versed in understanding the nuances of running statistical packages as well. Or so coming back to it, is it a knowledge-based thing you feel, or is it a time thing in the North America where it's everyone wants answers now and we don't have the resources?
I think it's probably more a time thing. Okay. The statistics piece is, most of this doesn't, I'm a big fan of Occam's razor, and I've gone, full circle from like, oh, we need really complex things to like, what? Practitioners think in terms of risk and probability. And if I can build simple models that produce basic numbers that are explainable, sometimes that's more important, because getting them to have those conversations alongside their domain expertise is really valuable. And that's an important thing. Numbers can only tell us so much. The domain experts have a lot of knowledge that isn't captured in those numbers. So I don't think it's not an overly statsy thing. I mean, most of this stuff can be done in Excel if you didn't want to write code. And I have examples on my blog of how to do a lot of this stuff in Excel and in code. So I think it's more a time thing. And I think the time thing is due to a lack of understanding of maybe what this person's role should be. So if we think about it, it's keeping up with the Joneses. Oh, that university just got this technology. We need force plates. And, the athletic department or the front office, they go and they say, okay, great, get force plates. And they buy that without thinking about, one, what kind of questions do we want to answer with this? How can we use this? And then two, who's going to be the person to ask and answer those questions? And so this falls in the lap of, the assistant strength coach or the assistant athletic trainer. And even if they're very well equipped to do this, most of the time they want to be a great strength coach or athletic trainer. They don't want to be doing technology and running science analysis and projects and building web apps and building interactive reports and things like that. Like, that's not what they want to do. So you're in this, you're kind of in this conundrum where you have the technology, you haven't really thought through what you want or what you expect from that technology. And then you have the people that are doing it that probably aren't in the best position to utilize their, being an assistant strength coach and having to do all this would be really tough, just because, like, well, when do you write programs? When do you coach people? When do you'd really probably want someone that's dedicated to tie these things across all of the sporting operation, from medical to strength and conditioning to coaching, to help the decision process. A lot of times the information that's being generated can be used for other departments. It's just the way that you talk about it. The jump stuff, if we're measuring players at training camp for archetypes and figuring out, like, well, who's deficient in this, and how might that change their training program? That's valuable information. Oh, this guy's impulse is really bad, and we know impulse ties to these on-field metrics, and let's see if we can improve his impulse. The alternative is, like, using it for a different, maybe like for the coaching department to say, like, well, this guy's impulse is really low compared to guys in this position, but if you change him to this position, he'd be one of the better players, and maybe he'd have better success there if we use him in this different way strategically. Or maybe it's identifying for the front office, like, hey, we brought in these 10 tryout guys, and, like, man, these 2 guys out of the 10 guys, like, these 2 guys really stand out athletically. They're tryout guys. They're not on a team. Do you want to just stash them on the practice squad and see if they do anything? See if they can see if this athleticism can manifest into something. So a lot of times information can be used, but you need someone to think more broadly about it than just being, dialed in the weight room.
This is a quote from the blog. The aim of the applied sports scientist or the sports science department should be to answer questions across the entire sporting organization. You mentioned those 4 pillars, and you just mentioned what we talked just in the previous sentence. This shouldn't simply be limited to matters of strength and conditioning. Do you also mean technically, tactically, game time decisions? Is that something that you model as well? And then maybe communicating that, is that more of you're speaking with a coach, informing versus persuading in terms and measures of those numbers or what you're seeing?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, again, if we think back to that NBA example, we can start to tie this stuff back to some form of technical or tactical ability for the player in terms of, how you use them. I don't know. I mean, I make up an example of basketball as, like, let's say you bring in guys for tryouts, and you have getting the coaches to standardize drills for tryouts would be really important. Maybe you have, like, a pick and roll drill, and it's like, oh man, like, of all the guys that we've tested, we put on wearable tracking in the tryout, and man, this guy comes off the pick and roll faster than 90% of the players that we've tested ever before. Like, is that something that's of value even for 5 minutes in a game, because they're a player that's just trying out? Like, they're not going to cost any money to, to take a shot on those kinds of things. Or how the physical measurables map to those, again, identifying the parameters of the game, how physical measurables maybe map to those parameters, and saying, like, man, we just tested this guy in these things, and those map to game outputs in this way. Is there any value of this player to our team from a tactical standpoint? Like, how could we use this player? Or maybe a position change would make sense.
A lot to that. It's very interesting. I catch myself, Patrick, and I don't know, maybe it's my training. Sometimes pessimist is the wrong word. I feel like team sports are so chaotic that it's so hard to measure those things. You know what I mean? Then again, I don't have the ability to model like you either. So I catch myself thinking, how do we measure that? Like, how does one measure that? I heard a quote a long time ago, and you may disagree with this. It says, history is not what happened. History is what survives the shipwrecks of judgment and luck. And if you look at shipwrecks or history, the scoreboard. I read a book just recently called Bad Data from a gentleman named Ryan Schryvers, and I'm lucky to have him on the podcast here in a couple months. And he was talking about his history in basketball, and he wrote a chapter called The Forest Through the Trees. Now, he's not a data analyst like you. He's a writer. I think he works. gosh, I don't know the exact profession, but he's not a data analyst. And he said at times, he said he was reverting back to his high school basketball career, and then he was trying to bring the story to life. And he said, one of the stats that I look at, he said, there's so many stats out right now, Corsi, this, that. He said, these are all stats that affect the scoreboard, but he said, it's hard. He said, we're looking at individual trees. Where in hockey, he said, if we're looking at one stat, how can we be reductive in looking at that? How can we, because the hardest thing to measure are the players not having possession of the puck, what they're doing away from the puck. And his hypothesis was maybe the best is just plus minus. Hey, you're on the ice for more goals than you score off the ice. You're a minus 25. That's not from an aggregate of looking at the forest. We do so at the expense of looking at every single tree, if that makes sense.
No, it's hard to disagree with the statement of the history is about those who survived. I totally agree. The things I would say is I'm not saying that this is easy by any stretch. This is really complicated. And I'm also, not saying that this is complete in any way. It's an incomplete picture. It's the things that we can measure. It's the ways that we can measure them. And doing statistics makes you very humbled, because I think it was Andrew Gelman, a great Bayesian statistician, teaches at Columbia political science, statistics, and does a lot of election forecasting. And I think it was him that he had a quote where he said, someone said, "Oh, Andrew, who's going to win this election? Or, can't you tell us? Like, you're a statistician." And he said, "Well, no, statistics doesn't tell us what's going to happen. All it does is tells us how certain or uncertain we are about the outcome." And that's really what it is. Like, we're measuring these things with a considerable amount of noise and context. So your pessimism is well received. My thing is that we're trying to quantify these things, but we're very upfront about the uncertainty that we have around them.
Sure.
So for me, when I sit down and look at, let's say, players in the draft, instead of estimating point estimates, I always estimate prediction intervals or a full distribution. And I sit there and I talk about these things. And if the domain experts don't agree with what I have to say, then I'm like, oh, am I missing something here?
Yep.
Is there something else that I can't see that the data can't tell me? So we try and have those conversations. And the way I describe it is, this is, and it's the same in strength and conditioning, it's the same in medical. You're on the highway and you want to change lanes. And the first thing that you do is you check in your rear view mirror, and then you check in your side view mirror. And if you're clear, you go. And so I always say, the rear view mirror for maybe a strength coach, maybe a medical person, maybe a scout, maybe a coach, the rear view mirror is the models. They have models too. They're not mathematical models, but they're mental models, the heuristics and things that they built from watching players over time. That's their rear view mirror. That's what they're going to hinge on. And the side view mirror is maybe like the stuff that our department provides them. And if those check out, let's go ahead and change lanes. For us, it's the flip. Like our rear view mirror is like, well, we built some models, and maybe instead of building one model, we built 4 models, and we look at how they all behave within the same thing, because they might tell different stories. Other than like a famous research of where they give 20 different groups the same data and the same question, and they all come back with 20 different responses based on what kind of model they used, what kind of assumptions they took, all those things. So that's our rear view mirror. And our side view mirror is like what the domain experts are telling us. And what we're looking for is where do we align to begin to have the conversation? So it's not easy to do. It's horribly complex. It's horribly confounded by many things. I try and apply simple approaches and simple models to these types of questions. And I just try and be very upfront about our uncertainty. And if I can compare them against a benchmark, like, for example, I'm trying to think of like a good benchmark that we would use, like, let's say like in return to play, estimating the time it takes to come back from a hamstring. The benchmark would be when the players get hurt, recording what the medical person, when they make the diagnosis, they say this is going to be a 3-week, this is going to be a 4-week. The model approach would be that we actually track the things that the player does over time and see how fast it takes them to get back. If the model is estimating the return to play time, either longer or shorter, better than the benchmark, which is just the human, the domain expert, then I'd probably lean towards the model in using that as my bits of information. Not that I wouldn't listen to the domain expert, I would, but how I weight those things might change. And there might be other opportunities where we weight it differently. I think the domain experts have a lot of knowledge that can't be captured with just this stuff. And the world is complex. So it's helpful to get their view of things as well. And if we can capture it, even better in terms of them writing it down or scoring things, that how to measure anything is a lot about scoring things. And so if they can score things, that becomes a feature in a model. And that's really useful because now we're using a model that contains the domain experts' information along with data that we've generated in other places. And that becomes a more holistic, not just a holistic picture, but it comes very bespoke to the people that are within the building, because no one else is going to give those types of responses. No other domain expert might respond the same way. So that they become a part of the model, and that helps with buy-in and things. It helps with discussions and things like that.
You talk about models. I want to ask a couple more. You talked about Occam's razor. For your models, you said simple better, right? Ceteris paribus, all things being equal. Do you use simple models like linear regression to try to eke out the confounders? Like, how do you try to, and you don't have to get into detail, but what are some simple models that is it linear regression? Is that a big one that you might resort to just for simplicity's sake?
There's times when we use more complex things, maybe machine learning type of algorithms. They're a little more black box. And because of that, the predictions that you get returned to you, a lot of times it's kind of like, well, we predicted, the outcome predicted is this. It's like, oh, why is it that? It's like, because the algorithm says so. That's the problem with black box models. We actually wrote a paper on this about injury prediction models in sports medicine, which I could send you if you want to put in the show notes, and talking about black box models and the problems with them, because practitioners have to deal with making interventions. And something like a linear regression or a logistic regression or a Poisson regression or something like that allows us to directly see via the beta coefficients, directly see the size of the effect of that one thing. So we can sit there and we can potentially say, like, of all these variables, and we know that this is the outcome, if we try and intervene on this thing, we might have a higher chance of improving this outcome than if we intervene on something else and spin our wheels, which you don't always get from a black box model. Sometimes you can get variable importance measures and you can produce SHAP values, but it's not as direct and it's not as clear. So yeah, simple model. I mean, linear regression is something we would use all the time. Even just, you can do a lot of great work with very good descriptive analysis, producing, basic descriptive analysis and basic summaries of distributions or confidence intervals or credible intervals or prediction intervals, depending on which sort of framework you're working in. Those can have massive utility just in terms of beginning discussions. And ultimately, decisions within sport are made with multiple people around the table. You're only one part of the discussion. So sometimes just having that type of information is enough fodder to get the ball rolling and get people to talk about things. And so that can be really useful.
Unbelievable. Patrick, where can listeners find more about you and what's next on the horizon? You mentioned you have a couple papers that are getting ready to be brought through
published,
in terms of published. Could you tell the readers a little bit about those papers?
We have a couple on some open science type of stuff coming out, and some on single subject type analysis coming up. And then I have some PhD students still. And so we have a few on kind of like modeling, more like trajectory based stuff, like changes over time and things like that. As far as like where people could find me, Twitter, it's at OSP Patrick. OptimumSportsPerformance.com is my blog, and you could search. There's all kinds of like free code and things. And then I have a screencast that I do once a week, Tidy Explained. So at Tidy_explained on Twitter. And that's totally free. Myself and a colleague, Ellis Hughes, who's a statistical programmer. We do this for free. It's all in R. And the idea is just to kind of like teach people, like how to do things. And we go through all kinds of stuff like visualizing data, functional programming, to, writing your own loops and functions, stats, and all kinds of stuff. And we take questions from the listeners. And so it's been a pretty cool project. We've been doing it since 2020. I think we've missed maybe 6 weekends. So we've done a lot, but yeah, it's totally free. And people can go on there and go on the YouTube channel and pop their questions and we'll answer them and things like that. And it's been really cool just to get the feedback, like from people saying, this has helped me get a new job. It's helped me get a promotion. It's helped me, ace an interview, things like that. So those are the main places that you could find me on the web.
The applied sports science and air quotes, I'm going to have to wait to take those off till I get even halfway as smart as you.
Oh, no.
I appreciate your time in scaling a message, and I learned a ton in our hour and 10-minute conversation. I can't thank you again. Our guest today has been Dr. Patrick Ward. Patrick, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.